Today's podcast. Artist Larsen Hertervig, born in 1830 and living until 1902, transformed personal vulnerability into one of the most luminous expressions in Norwegian art history. After humiliation and what the study described as gaslighting that undermined his identity in Düsseldorf, he suffered a breakdown followed by institutional loss of autonomy. The quiet years in Stavanger became a period of inner reconstruction, where nature and small sketches gradually returned a sense of language and self. The result was the visionary, translucent landscapes that today define his legacy, paintings in which suffering becomes light. Listen to the story. Larsen Hertervig, the artist who turned sorrow into light. Chapter 1. Introduction. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're stepping into both the life and the inner world of one of Norway's most enigmatic painters, Larsen Hertervig. He's a figure who keeps resurfacing whenever we talk about artists who painted as much with their emotions as with their brushes. And with me is Thor Sivert Fritland, who has studied Hertervig in depth and written a new psychological and art historical synthesis exploring how the artist's life, vulnerability, and creative vision are woven together. Thor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk about an artist who has fascinated me for so many years, someone whose landscapes are as emotionally charged as they are visually striking. Hertervig contains both light and darkness, both pain and transcendence. In my view, he's one of the most complex and compelling figures in Norwegian art history.
There's something almost unreal about his landscapes, as if they vibrate or breathe. Many describe them as visionary, even translucent. And yet we know his life was marked by emotional fragility, institutionalization, and poverty. How do you understand that tension?
For me, that tension is exactly what makes Hertervig so deeply human. As I write in the study, his landscapes form a symbolic language in which personal suffering is transformed into universal meaning. He doesn't just paint nature, he paints his inner experience. He paints the inner landscape, and he does it with an intensity that still resonates today.
And it all began early. He grew up on Borgia and Tisfer, and even as a child he showed an unusual talent for drawing and painting. But it wasn't until Düsseldorf that he truly found his direction, right?
Exactly. In the 1850s, he was considered a major young talent, and he was given the opportunity to study at the Düsseldorf Academy, the leading center for romantic landscape painting at the time. There he encountered both Norwegian and German artists. And even though he never met August Capelin in person, discovering Capelin's paintings was transformative. Capelin opened a door for him, a door into the melancholic, the sublime, the psychologically charged landscape.
So, what we see in Hertervig's paintings isn't just nature, it's a kind of inner geography.
Precisely. It's nature carrying experience, nature carrying vulnerability, nature carrying hope. That's why his work still moves us.
Chapter 2. Who was Hertervig? When you describe it like that, I almost get the sense that Herdervig painted with one foot in reality and the other in something dreamlike, something just out of reach. Was that something he developed in Düsseldorf, or does it go deeper?
I think it goes much deeper. Dusseldorf gave him technique, discipline, and an artistic community, but the inner vision, that was already there. He had this intuitive ability to see the landscape as a psychological space. It's as if he wasn't painting trees and cliffs, but states of being, moods, a kind of existential vibration.
That's fascinating, because when you look at paintings like Forest Lake or Borgia, that vibration is exactly what you feel. There's something unsettled, but also something hopeful, as if nature is both threatening and comforting at the same time.
Exactly. That duality runs through his entire body of work. He paints nature as a place where a person can lose themselves, but also find themselves. And that makes sense when you consider his life story. The emotional fragility, the psychiatric breakdowns, the poverty. He lived in a constant tension between dissolution and survival.
And yet he creates art that feels so pure, so luminous. It's almost paradoxical.
That's what makes him so unique. Many artists paint their darkness directly. Herdervig does something different. He lets the darkness filter the light. He lets vulnerability become a lens. That's why his landscapes feel translucent, as if they're seen through a mind that is both wounded and profoundly open.
That's beautifully put. And at the same time, it's easy to forget that he was considered a major talent in his own time. He was sent to Düsseldorf because people saw something extraordinary in him.
Yes, and that's important to remember. He wasn't just a tragic figure. He was an artist with a completely singular voice, often mentioned alongside Munch when we talk about psychological depth. And even though he never met August Kaplan, discovering Kaplan's paintings was a kind of artistic recognition. Kaplan showed him that melancholy could be monumental, that the inner landscape could be as vast as the outer one.
So, when we look at Hertervig's paintings today, we're really seeing a dialogue between him and nature, between him and Kaplan, between him and his own psyche.
Yes, and maybe even a dialogue with us. There's something in Hertervig's art that invites us into our own vulnerability. He doesn't paint to impress. He paints to understand. And in doing so, he helps us understand a little more about ourselves.
Chapter 3. The Early Years. The Sensitive Child. Let's go back to the beginning, to Borgi and Tisver, who was young Lars.
Lars Hertervig grew up on Borgi in Tisver, surrounded by simplicity and a kind of silence you can almost touch. He was a child who absorbed the world differently from others. Quiet, observant, almost translucent in temperament. People describe him as introverted, perceptive, emotionally permeable, the kind of personality we'd now associate with high sensitivity, that blend of vulnerability and creative depth. He was raised in a Quaker family, and that shaped him. Life was strict, modest, without extravagance. But the nature around him was boundless. That's where he found room to breathe. When the family moved to Stavanger in 1837, he was already showing an unusual talent for drawing. He entered a painter's apprenticeship at 8 years old and passed his journeyman's exam before he turned 19. That tells you something about both his talent and his discipline.
So, even as a child, he carried an inner world richer than most?
Absolutely. And nature became his first language. That's where the roots of his entire artistic vision lie. For Hertervig, nature wasn't just a subject. It was a space he could step into. A place where he could exist without being judged or misunderstood. Where others saw trees, he saw relationships. Where others saw water, he saw depth. Where others saw light, he saw meaning. When I study his life, it becomes clear that nature didn't just inspire him, it sustained him. It acted as an emotional resonating chamber. Everything he couldn't say out loud, everything he couldn't share with the people around him, found form in the landscape. That's why his paintings are never simple depictions. They're inner states translated into forest, water, stone, and sky.
The way you describe it, it almost sounds like a form of self regulation, like nature gave him a place to land.
That's exactly it. For someone as sensitive as he was, someone so easily pierced by other people's words and glances, nature was a place where he could be whole. It demanded nothing from him. It didn't manipulate him. It didn't laugh at him. It didn't reject him. It simply existed, and in that stillness, he could hear his own inner voice more clearly. When we talk today about art as transformation, this is what we mean. Hertervig didn't use art to escape his experiences. He used it to process them. He took what was painful, confusing, unbearable, and he gave it shape. He made it visible, but in a way that didn't destroy him. He turned it into something he could carry.
So, his art isn't an expression of illness, it's an expression of survival?
Exactly. His art isn't pathology, it's resilience. It's a way of staying alive. He painted to understand. He painted to find a language larger than the words he had access to. And maybe that's why his work still hits us so deeply. Because it doesn't just show nature, it shows a human being trying to find footing in a world that was often too harsh for him. It shows the struggle to preserve one's sensitivity in the face of humiliation, rejection, and psychological pressure. It shows how a soul can bend without breaking.
It gives a whole new dimension to the way we look at his landscapes.
It does. Nature was his first language. Art became his second. And through those two, he found a way to exist in the world, even when the world didn't quite know how to exist with him.
You mentioned that he found a language in nature early on, but he also found a language in drawing. When did that begin?
Very early. There are accounts of him as a small boy sitting for hours, drawing lines, shapes, tiny landscapes. He approached it almost meditatively. At 8 years old, he entered an apprenticeship with the Quaker leader Ender Dahl in Stavanger. 8 years old, already on a craftsman's path. He passed his journeyman's exam before 1849, before he was 19. That speaks to his talent, yes, but also to his need. Drawing wasn't just a skill. It was a way of being in the world.
So he didn't paint because he could, he painted because he had to?
Exactly. In every spare moment, he painted whatever he could get his hands on. And in 1849, he joined Bernhard Hansen's drawing class for apprentices and journeymen. That was the first time he was seen as something more than a craftsman. That was where he was recognized as an artist. And then, the following year, everything changes. He's discovered by the shipowner and merchant H.G.B. Sunt. Sunt sees something in him, a depth, an originality, and raises funds so Hertervig can receive a real art education.
That must have been a huge turning point for a young man from a Quaker family.
It was. And it's important to note, his family wasn't thrilled. Quakers were skeptical of art as a profession. They saw it as unnecessary, maybe even spiritually distracting. But they didn't stop him. They let him go. And that's one of the most pivotal moments in Norwegian art history, that this quiet, sensitive boy was allowed to follow his inner compass.
There's something touching about that. A family that doesn't understand him but still lets him go.
Yes, and that pattern follows him throughout his life. He's often misunderstood, often rejected, often seen as strange or difficult. But there are always one or two people who see him, who lift him, who gives him just enough support to keep going. Sant was the first of those. Without him, we might never have seen Hertervig's art.
And yet, even with talent, support, and opportunity, he carries this extreme sensitivity with him. How did that shape him as a young man?
It made him both vulnerable and perceptive. He absorbed everything. He sensed moods, glances, tiny shifts in the atmosphere around him. It made him a remarkable observer, but also someone who could be overwhelmed easily. When we look at his paintings today, we're not just seeing nature. We're seeing a nervous system that registered the world with an intensity most of us could never bear. He didn't just paint what he saw, he painted what he felt when he saw it.
So, when we look at a Hertervig landscape, we're really seeing a child's way of experiencing the world, expressed through an adult artist's hand?
That's a beautiful way to put it. Yes. It's the child's openness, the child's vulnerability, the child's ability to let the world in, combined with an adult's technique and an adult's pain. That's why his landscapes feel so translucent. They're not just nature. They're temperament.
Chapter 4. Düsseldorf, Light, Longing, and the Fall. Then he arrives in Düsseldorf in 1852, a major artistic center, a place where he finally gets the chance to develop his talent. But also the beginning of a psychological unraveling.
Yes, Düsseldorf is one of the most dramatic chapters in his life. On one hand, he flourishes artistically. He studies under Hans Gude. He encounters romantic landscape painting at its most refined, and he discovers the work of August Capellan. Capellan painted forests, ponds, and ancient trees with a poetic, almost symbolic undertone, and Hertervig absorbed that approach with an intensity you can practically feel in his own paintings. This is where he truly finds his voice. Nature as psyche, light as inner movement, the landscape as a room for the soul.
But at the same time, something personal happens, something with enormous consequences.
Yes. And this is where the tragedy begins to take shape. He falls in love with Helene Winkelmann, a young woman he never really manages to connect with. And that vulnerability is exploited by some of the Norwegian students around him. They arrange fake meetings. They mock him. They manipulate him. They turn him into an inside joke. This is a crucial new perspective in the study. Hertervig's psychological collapse wasn't just illness. It was the result of relational trauma, of narcissistic manipulation and gaslighting.
So he was subjected to what we would today call emotional abuse?
Exactly. And not just teasing, but systematic breakdown. I describe it more as narcissistic voodoo and gaslighting that undermined his identity. He was ridiculed, rejected, humiliated. For someone as hypersensitive as Hertervig, this was devastating. Let's be clear, this wasn't a man who just became sick. This was a man who was subjected to psychological violence.
What did that do to him internally?
It triggered hallucinations, paranoia, and a collapse of identity. When you're exposed to gaslighting long enough, you lose your grip on your own reality. When you're triangulated, used as a pawn in someone else's game, you lose trust in your own feelings. When you're humiliated publicly, you lose your footing in yourself. For Hertervig, already hypersensitive, this became a storm. He had no language for what was happening. No support. No tools. And then something breaks.
So Düsseldorf was both his artistic birth and his emotional downfall?
Yes. And that's what makes this period so heartbreaking. He finds light in art and darkness in the people around him. He discovers the inner space of nature and loses his own. He finds Kaplan, but loses himself. Düsseldorf is where he learns to paint the soul, but it's also where his own soul is wounded.
It's almost as if he learns to paint light at the same moment his own light begins to flicker.
That's exactly right. Because in Düsseldorf, two things happen simultaneously. He develops an artistic vision that is completely unique in Norwegian art history. He is subjected to a form of social and emotional violence he never fully recovers from. And that double imprint, the light and the wound, is present in everything he paints afterward.
So when we look at his later landscapes, we're really seeing traces of Düsseldorf, both what he found and what he lost.
Yes, Düsseldorf isn't just a place in his biography. It's a scar in the paintings, an echo, a shadow in the light. It's where he learns that nature can hold everything human, and that the people around him sometimes can't.
Chapter 5. Düsseldorf. Love, Rejection, and Collapse. We've talked about the light he found in Düsseldorf, but it's also where the darkness begins to gather. What caused Hertervig's psychological collapse?
To understand the collapse, you must look at both the emotional and the social layers. During his first year in Düsseldorf, Hertervig lived with the widow Henriette Winkelmann, and he quietly fell in love with her oldest daughter, Helene. It was a silent, almost wordless infatuation, typical of a man who felt far more than he ever expressed. But that love would have dramatic consequences.
How so?
When he wasn't allowed to stay with the family the following year, he tried to maintain contact with Helene. He visited the house, tried to speak with her, tried to understand the rejection. But the family wanted nothing to do with him. Eventually, the police had to intervene to stop his repeated visits. For someone as hypersensitive as Hertervig, this wasn't just heartbreak. It was an identity-level catastrophe.
And then the fellow students get involved?
Yes, and this is the part of the story that has long been overlooked. Some of the Norwegian art students began to tease him. Not harmless teasing, but targeted humiliation. They arranged fake meetings with Helene. They tricked him into believing she wanted to see him. And then they laughed when he showed up. This is what we would today call emotional abuse. Gaslighting, triangulation, narcissistic manipulation.
So, was he subjected to a form of psychological violence?
Exactly. And it's important to be precise. Hertervig didn't become ill in a vacuum. He was subjected to relational trauma. He was humiliated, mocked, and manipulated by people he believed were friends. For a man already extremely sensitive, this was devastating.
What happened to him after that?
He began developing delusional ideas. He experienced hallucinations. His speech became fragmented. He lost his grip on reality. What was later interpreted as melancholy or schizophrenia was, in many ways, a reaction to a situation he had no language to understand. When you're exposed to gaslighting long enough, you lose contact with your own reality. When you're rejected by the person you love, you lose hope. When you're humiliated publicly, you lose yourself. For Hertervig, this became a stormy night.
So Düsseldorf was both his artistic peak and his emotional downfall?
Yes. And that's what makes this period so heartbreaking. He finds his artistic voice, but loses his inner stability. He discovers the light in nature, but the darkness in the people around him. He learns to paint the soul, but his own soul is wounded.
It's almost as if he was shaped and shattered in the same place.
That's a brutal, but accurate way to put it. Düsseldorf gave him everything he needed as an artist, and took from him everything he needed as a human being. That duality is what makes Hertervig so deeply moving. He didn't just paint landscapes. He painted the consequences of being a sensitive person in an insensitive world.
Chapter 6. Gasted. Loss of autonomy and identity. Thor. After the breakdown in Düsseldorf, Hertervig is sent to Gasted. This is one of the darkest chapters in his life. What happens there?
What happens at Gausted is brutal, not necessarily physically, but psychologically. He's stripped of the most fundamental thing a human being has: autonomy. The Norwegian Biographical Encyclopedia notes that he was discharged as not cured and legally incapacitated. That meant he no longer had the right to make decisions about his own life, his finances, or his future. For a man whose identity had already been undermined in Düsseldorf, this was another blow. It's as if the world said to him, "You can't trust yourself. You can't govern yourself. You are no longer a full person." This is a form of psychological erasure.
How did that affect his sense of self?
It shattered it. When you're legally incapacitated, you don't just lose rights, you lose the mirror of yourself. You lose the sense of being a subject. You become an object that others manage. For Hertervig, already hypersensitive and traumatized, this was an identity-level catastrophe. He had been gaslit in Düsseldorf. Now he was defined as insane by the system. It's a double dismantling, first social, then institutional.
What was treatment like at Gasted at that time?
Gasted in the 1850s wasn't a place for healing. It was a place for containment. There was no modern psychology, no understanding of trauma, no insight into relational harm. No one saw the connection between what he had endured and how he responded. He wasn't met with care, he was met with categories. He wasn't seen as a human being, he was seen as a diagnosis. And here's the crucial part. He wasn't treated for what had actually happened to him. He was treated for what others assumed he was.
So Gasted amplified the damage?
Yes. What could have been an opportunity for support became an extension of the trauma. He had been manipulated, humiliated, and mocked in Düsseldorf. At Gausted, he was stripped of his identity. It's as if he loses two layers of himself. First the emotional layer, then the legal one.
How did this affect his art?
This is where it becomes incredibly powerful. When he leaves Gausted, he isn't healed, he's wounded. But he's also free. Free from the environment that destroyed him. Free from the pressure. Free from manipulation. And in that freedom, which is also a profound loneliness, he begins to rebuild himself. Not through words, not through therapy, but through nature and through art. That's why the 9 silent years in Stavanger matter so much. He has to find his way back to himself after both people and institutions tried to define him out of existence.
So Gasted wasn't the end, it was a 0 point?
Exactly. A painful 0 point. A place where everything was taken from him and where he later had to find everything again. When we look at the visionary works he creates after 1865, we're not seeing a man who was destroyed. We're seeing a man who rose, who found a new language, who found a new light, who found a new identity, one he built himself, not one imposed on him. Gausted took his autonomy. Art gave it back.
Chapter 7. The 9 Quiet Years in Stavanger. 4. You've mentioned before that the period after Gausted, the 9 Quiet Years in Stavanger, is often misunderstood. Many interpret it as stagnation, as proof that Hertervig was broken as an artist. But you see it differently. Can you explain?
Gladly. It's true that this period has traditionally been portrayed as a dark void in Hertervig's life. He painted very little, completed almost nothing, and lived in poverty and isolation. But when you look closely at both his circumstances and the psychological dynamics at play, the picture becomes far more nuanced. First, Hertervig returned to Stavanger after losing everything. He was discharged from Gausted as not cured and legally incapacitated. That meant he no longer had control over his own life or finances. For a man already hypersensitive, this must have been an identity level like an earthquake. He had endured rejection, humiliation, manipulation, and institutionalization. He simply needed time.
So, you're saying silence was a form of healing?
Exactly. This wasn't passive stagnation, it was an active withdrawal. In modern psychology, we'd call it self-protective isolation. He pulled away from the environments that had harmed him and tried to reestablish some kind of inner balance. He had no access to therapy, no support system, no language for what he'd been through. All he had was silence and nature. During this period, he'd draw mostly sketches, small, intimate drawings, often unfinished, but they reveal a man trying to navigate his own inner landscape. It's as if he's sorting through memories, pain, identity, trying to understand what is his and what was forced upon him.
It almost sounds like an inner cleansing.
That's a beautiful way to put it. He had to purge everything that had been imposed on him, the ridicule, the shame, the gaslighting. He had to find his way back to the part of himself that existed before Düsseldorf. And that takes time. 9 years, in fact. But that long silence is precisely what makes the turning point around 1865 so remarkable. When he begins to paint again, it's as if he's found a new voice. A voice no longer tries to satisfy academic ideals or anyone else's expectations. A voice that comes from within.
So, the 9 years weren't an ending, they were preparation?
Yes, they were an inner transformation, a necessary pause. A space where he entered dialogue with himself, with nature, with his memories. When he emerged from that period, he was no longer the promising Düsseldorf student. He was a visionary artist with a language entirely on his own.
You mentioned earlier that he found a language in nature, but he also found one in drawing. When did that begin?
Very early. There are accounts of him as a small boy sitting for hours, drawing lines, shapes, tiny landscapes. He approached it almost meditatively. At 8 years old, he entered an apprenticeship with the Quaker leader Ender Dahl in Stavanger. 8 years old, already on a craftsman's path. He passed his journeyman's exam before 1849, before he turned 19. That speaks to his talent, yes, but also to his need. Drawing wasn't just a skill, it was a way of being in the world.
So, he didn't paint because he could, he painted because he had to?
Exactly. In every spare moment, he painted whatever he could. And in 1849, he joined Bernhard Hansen's drawing class for apprentices and journeymen. That was the first time he was seen as something more than a craftsman, the first time he was recognized as an artist. And then, the following year, everything changes. He's discovered by the ship owner H.G.B. Sunt. Sunt sees something in his depth, originality, and raises funds so Hertervig can receive a real art education.
That must have been a huge turning point for a young man from a Quaker family.
It was, and it's important to note, His family wasn't thrilled. Quakers were skeptical of art as a profession. They saw it as unnecessary, maybe even spiritually distracting. But they didn't stop him. They let him go. And that's one of the most pivotal moments in Norwegian art history, that this quiet, sensitive boy was allowed to follow his inner compass.
There's something touching about that. A family that doesn't understand him but still lets him go.
Yes, and that pattern follows him throughout his life. He's often misunderstood, often rejected, often seen as strange or difficult. But there are always one or two people who see him, who lift him, who gives him just enough support to keep going. Sant was the first of those. Without him, we might never have seen Hertervig's art.
And yet, even with talent, support, and opportunity, he carries this extreme sensitivity with him. How did that shape him as a young man?
It made him both vulnerable and perceptive. He absorbed everything. He sensed moods, glances, tiny shifts in the atmosphere around him. It made him a remarkable observer, but also someone who could be overwhelmed easily. When we look at his paintings today, we're not just seeing nature. We're seeing a nervous system that registered the world with an intensity most of us could never bear. He didn't just paint what he saw, he painted what he felt when he saw it.
So, when we look at a Hertervig landscape, we're really seeing a child's way of experiencing the world, expressed through an adult artist's hand.
That's exactly it. It's the child's openness, the child's vulnerability, the child's ability to let the world in, combined with an adult's technique and an adult's pain. That's why his landscapes feel so translucent. They're not just nature, they're temperament.
Chapter 8. An Inner Reorientation, Breaking Free from Gaslighting. You've mentioned that the mice study point to a different interpretation, an inner reorientation, a reckoning with narcissistic manipulation through gaslighting. What does that mean?
It means the 9 quiet years weren't an empty void, they were a chamber of transformation. To understand that we must return to Düsseldorf. That's where he was subjected to a form of social and emotional manipulation we would today call gaslighting. Fake meetings, mockery, humiliation, rejection. For someone as hypersensitive as Hertervig, this wasn't just painful, it was identity dissolving. Gaslighting makes a person doubt their own reality. When you're exposed to it long enough, you lose contact with your own senses, your own judgment, your own identity. That's what Hertervig had to fight his way back from.
So, he had to unlearn what had been done to him?
Exactly. He had to separate his own voice from the voices imposed on him in Düsseldorf. He had to find a space where he could be free from the forces that tried to define him as sick, weak, or unworthy. And he didn't do it through confrontation. He did it through withdrawal. He didn't do it through words. He did it through silence. He didn't do it through therapy. He did it through nature and art, the only languages he could truly trust.
How do we see this in his art?
Even though he painted very little during this period, the sketches reveal traces of an inner process. They're often unfinished, as if he's searching for a new way of seeing. It's no longer the Düsseldorf gaze, the academic, the technical. It's something more intuitive, more vulnerable, more inward. And when he begins painting again around 1865, it's as if something has been cleansed. The work becomes lighter, more transparent, more dreamlike. It's as if he has stripped away the psychological residue of manipulation and shame, and what remains is a clearer connection to his own inner world.
So, the 9 years were a kind of inner detox?
Yes, that's exactly what they were. A psychological detox. He had to purge everything that wasn't his, everything that had been projected onto him, everything that had distorted his inner compass. And when he emerges from that period, he's no longer a victim. He's an artist who has found his own light, a light that no longer comes from outside, but from within.
Chapter 9. The Turning Point. The Visionary Art Awakens. And then, around 1865, something happens. Or, you've described the 9 quiet years as an inner cleansing, a kind of psychological detox. But suddenly, around this time, there's a shift. A turning point. What changes?
It's one of the most fascinating moments in Hertervig's life. After nearly a decade of silence, fragmented sketches, and internal struggle, he suddenly begins to paint again, and what he creates is unlike anything he had done before. It's as if he's walked through a long night and emerged on the other side with a new way of seeing. What happens around 1865 is that he returns to nature as his first language, but now with a new clarity. He no longer paints to satisfy academic ideals or to earn recognition from the art world. He paints to express something deeply personal, something that have ripened in the silence.
How do we see this in the paintings?
The most striking change is the light. It's as if his entire artistic universe opens up. Where the Düsseldorf period was marked by heavy clouds, dramatic contrasts, and melancholy, the later works become transparent, ethereal, almost dreamlike. He uses simple materials, paper, homemade pigments, yet the result is a visionary style no one else in Norway was painting at the time. The light isn't just a visual element, it's a psychological symbol. It represents clarity, hope, and transcendence. It's as if he's painting his own path out of darkness.
So, this isn't just a technical evolution, it's an emotional and psychological transformation?
Absolutely. That's why I say his art isn't a symptom of illness. It's a transformation of experience. He takes everything he's been through, rejection, manipulation, institutionalization, isolation, and he reshapes it into a new language. A language of light, of stillness, of inner space. When you look at works like Forest Lake, Old Pine Trees, or From Borgia, you're not just seeing nature. You're seeing a soul that has found a way to express itself without being destroyed by what happened to it. It's a form of emotional regulation, a way of staying whole.
It almost sounds like he painted himself back to life.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and I think it's true. He painted himself back to himself. He painted himself out of shame. He painted himself out of the gaslighting. He painted himself out of the identity others had forced onto him. And that's why this period is so important. This is where he becomes the Hertervig we know today, not the promising academy student, but the visionary artist who creates landscapes that are both earthly and spiritual, both concrete and symbolic.
So, the turning point in 1865 is really the birth of his true artistic voice?
Yes. This is where he finds his own voice, a voice no longer shaped by others' expectations, but by his own inner truth. And that voice is what makes him timeless.
What do these paintings express?
Light as hope, forests as inner rooms, water as emotional depth. The study puts it beautifully. He didn't just paint nature, he painted the energy around him. Art became his way of regulating emotion. It was therapy before therapy existed.
Thor, you've said before that the light, the forests, and the water in Hertervig's paintings aren't just natural motifs, they're psychological symbols. Can you say more about that?
Gladly. For Hertervig, nature was never just nature. It was an inner map, an emotional language. And when you look at his paintings after the turning point in 1865, this becomes unmistakably clear. Light as hope, forest as inner space, water as emotional depth. These aren't metaphors I'm imposing, they're embedded in his expression. My study captures it perfectly. He didn't just paint nature, he painted the energy around him. And that's exactly what makes him unique. He didn't paint what the eye saw, he painted what the soul felt.
What do you mean when you say he painted the energy around him?
It's about how he used nature as a mirror for his inner state. After everything he'd endured, manipulation, rejection, institutionalization, he needed a language that could hold what he couldn't say in words. Art became his emotional regulator. It was therapy before therapy. When he paints light breaking through the trees, it's not just an aesthetic choice. It's an emotional movement, an expression of hope, clarity, a path out of darkness. When he paints forests, they're not forests you walk into. They're inner rooms, places where he could be alone with his thoughts without interference. And the water, it's always deep, still, almost hypnotic. It's the realm of feeling, memory, longing, everything beneath the surface.
So, does nature becomes a kind of self-portrait?
Yes, but not a portrait of his face, a portrait of his psyche. That's why his paintings feel so alive, so vibrating. They're not just visual, they're emotional, they're charged, they're processing in color and form. When he paints, he regulates his feelings. He creates order out of chaos. He gives shape to what would otherwise overwhelm him. And that's why he develops this transparent, almost spiritual style. It's not an aesthetic experiment, it's an inner necessity.
It sounds like his art was a lifeline.
It was. He painted to hold himself together. He painted to understand himself. He painted to find a space where he could be whole, even when the world around him was fractured. And that's what makes Hertervig so profoundly human. He used art the way many people today use therapy, meditation, or deep conversation. He used it to regulate, to process, to transform. That's why the paintings after 1865 are filled with light. It's not romanticism. It's not aesthetics. It's an inner victory, a quiet but powerful testament that he found a way through the darkness.
Chapter 10. How the visionary style evolved toward his final years. We've talked about the turning point around 1865 and how Hertervig discovered a new artistic language. But how did this visionary style continue to evolve? How do we see it mature as he approaches the end of his life?
What's remarkable about Hertervig is that he never calcified. He kept evolving right up until his final years, despite poverty, social marginalization, and a complete lack of recognition. It's almost paradoxical. The less external support he had, the more radical and personal his art became. In the first years after the turning point, we see a cautious opening. Light enters the compositions, forms soften, everything becomes more transparent. But as he grows more confident in his inner language, the paintings become bolder. He begins experimenting with thin layers of color, almost as if he's painting atmosphere rather than landscape.
So, he moves from painting nature to painting the mood of nature?
Exactly, and eventually he goes even further. He begins painting the inner landscape. That's why we call it visionary. It's no longer a forest, a pond, a hillside. It's a state of being, a feeling, an inner movement. He's not painting what the eye sees. He's painting what the soul experiences. In the later works, he almost dissolves the boundaries between motif and light. Trees become symbolic. Water becomes dreamlike. Horizons become spiritual. It's as if he's painting memories rather than reality, or perhaps reality as it feels from the inside.
How did his life circumstances shape this evolution?
They shaped everything. He lived in poverty, often dependent on the poorhouse. He couldn't afford canvas, so he painted on wrapping paper, cardboard, whatever he could find. But this limitation forced him to be inventive. The simple materials pushed him toward a technique that was light, luminous, almost watercolor-like, even when he used oil. And perhaps even more importantly, he painted without an audience, without expectations, without pressure. That gave him freedom few artists ever have. He wasn't painting for the market. He was painting to hold himself together, to express something that had no other outlet.
So, his art became more personal?
Yes, and more universal. That's the beauty of it. The deeper he went into his own inner world, the widely his art speaks. That's why his paintings resonate today. They're not tied to a specific time or place. They're human, existential. They're about light and darkness, hope and vulnerability, about finding a place in the world when the world doesn't offer you one.
How do we see this in his very last works?
In the final years, the paintings almost dissolve into pure light. It's as if he's painting a threshold between the earth and the inner, between nature and spirit. There's a stillness in these works that's utterly unique, a kind of peace, but also a longing. He truly evolved until the end. That's rare. Many artists find a form and stay there. Hertervig kept exploring, kept refining, kept opening new rooms inside himself. It's as if he painted himself closer to an inner truth.
So, the visionary style wasn't just a phase, it was a life journey?
Yes, it was a continuous movement, an inner journey that began in pain but ended in light. And that's why he stands as one of the most original voices in Norwegian art history. Not because he painted landscapes, but because he painted the human inner landscape in a way only he could.
Chapter 11. The values that carried Hertervig's art. Thor, we've talked about the evolution of his expression, the light, the inner landscape. But what were the fundamental values in Hertervig's art? What was he really building on?
That's a wonderful question, because when you look at Hertervig's life and work together, it becomes clear that he wasn't just painting motifs, he was painting a value system, an inner compass. And I often say it rests on three pillars. One, vulnerability as strength. Hertervig made the inner world visible. He didn't hide pain, he transformed it. He was someone who felt everything intensely. Instead of trying to mask that sensitivity, as many of us do, he allowed it to become part of his artistic language. He didn't paint to impress, he painted to understand. And that vulnerability is exactly what gives his work its emotional force. It's why his paintings still reach us today.
So, vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a resource?
Yes, a source of depth. He did what most of us fear. He gave form to the inner world. He turned private into the universal. To nature as psyche. For Hertervig, nature was never just nature. A landscape was never just a landscape. It was soul, memory, longing. When he painted a forest, he painted an inner room. When he painted water, he painted emotional depth. When he painted light, he painted hope. The study puts it beautifully. He didn't just paint nature, he painted the energy around him. That means he used nature as a psychological language. He didn't paint what the eye saw, he painted what the heart experienced.
So, nature becomes a kind of emotional topography?
Exactly. A mapping of the inner world. A way of expressing what couldn't be said directly. That's why his paintings feel alive. They're charged with feeling, memory, and experience. 3. Light as transcendence. Where August Capellan painted darkness, Hertervig painted the path out of it. The light in his later works isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's an existential movement. A direction. A will. A hope. He had lived through darkness, rejection, manipulation, institutionalization, poverty. But he didn't paint the darkness repeatedly. He painted the way through it. He painted what lies on the other side.
So, the light isn't just light, it's a form of transcendence?
Yes, it's an act of rising above. A way of saying, I wasn't destroyed. I found something else. That's why the light in his paintings feels so powerful. It isn't decorated. It's lived experience.
When you put it like that, it becomes clear that Hertervig didn't just paint landscapes, he painted a worldview.
Exactly. He painted values. He painted a way of being human. Vulnerability as strength. Nature as psyche. Light as transcendence. That's what makes him timeless. That's why we keep returning to him.
Chapter 12. How was Hertervig rediscovered after his death? Thor, we've talked about why Hertervig wasn't recognized in his own time. But today he's considered one of Norway's most original artists. How did that rediscovery happen? What made him suddenly rise into view after his death?
It's one of the most moving parts of his story. Because while he lived, he was almost entirely forgotten. He sold barely a painting. He lived in poverty. And he died without the faintest idea of the impact he would one day have. But after his death, something began to shift, slowly, quietly, but inevitably. The first thing that happened was that a handful of people began to notice the quality of what he had left behind. The Norwegian Biographical Encyclopedia describes how some of his works were shown at the Jubilee exhibition in 1914. And that became a turning point. Audiences saw something new, something they hadn't seen before. It was as if time had finally caught up with him.
So it took more than a decade after his death before people truly began to see him?
Yes, and that's not unusual for artists who are ahead of their time. What seemed strange or unfinished in his own era suddenly appeared modern, dreamlike, visionary. What had been interpreted as weakness was now seen as strength. What had been dismissed as technical deficiency was now recognized as originality. And something else has changed. Art history itself. After Impressionism, Symbolism, and the rise of modernism, audiences developed a new way of seeing. They were no longer bound to academic ideals. They were open to the intuitive, the emotional, the inner. Hertervig suddenly fit into an art history that didn't exist while he was alive.
So he was rediscovered because the world finally became ready for him?
Exactly. He was an artist who painted the future, not the present. And the future had to arrive before he could be understood. After 1914, art historians, collectors, and museums began to take interest. Stavanger Art Museum eventually built a major collection of his works. And then the research began to take him seriously. People realized he wasn't a mad painter, but a visionary one. Not a case, but a pioneer.
How did this change the way people saw his life?
It changed everything. Once people recognized the quality of the art, they began to see the human being behind it. They began to understand that he wasn't weak. He was sensitive. Not insane, but wounded. Not unfinished, but ahead. And then scholars began to read his life through a new psychological lens. They saw that his breakdown wasn't a mystery, but a reaction to manipulation and social cruelty. They saw that his isolation wasn't failure, but self-protection. They saw that his art wasn't a symptom of it, it was a transformation.
So, rediscovery wasn't just about art, it was about humanity?
Yes, that's what makes his story so powerful. He was rediscovered because his art was larger than the time he lived in. But he was loved because the man behind the art was larger than the pain he carried. Today, we see Hertervig as one of the most original voices in Norwegian art history. But we also see something more. A man who used art to survive. A man who found light in darkness. A man who was finally understood at last.
Chapter 13. Narcissistically inflicted psychological harm and why no contact saved him. Thor, you've mentioned before that Hertervig was subjected to something you call narcissistically inflicted psychological harm. Can you explain what you mean by that and why his choice to go no contact protected himself?
Yes, this is a crucial part of understanding his life. When we look at what happened in Düsseldorf, we're not just seeing a young man who was rejected. We're seeing a pattern of manipulation, mockery, and psychological pressure, what today would clearly be recognized as narcissistic abuse. It wasn't one incident. It was a series of violations that slowly eroded his sense of self. Let me break down the core mechanisms at play, because they're essential. 1. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is the act of making someone doubt their own reality. In Hertervig's case, this happened through fake romantic meetings, deliberate confusion, and public ridicule. He was turned into an object for other people's entertainment. For someone as sensitive and emotionally open as he was, this wasn't just hurtful, it was destabilizing. Gaslighting isn't just lying. It's a systematic dismantling of a person's inner compass. 2. Manipulation. Manipulation is about controlling another person's emotions or reactions for one's own benefit. In Düsseldorf, Hertervig was manipulated through humiliation, exclusion, and emotional exploitation. He was made vulnerable on purpose. This is a form of psychological violence, and it can be just as damaging as physical harm. 3. Triangulation. Triangulation means using a third person to create insecurity, jealousy, or confusion. In Hertervig's case, Helene Winkleman became a tool in other people's games. The fake meetings, the rumors, the teasing, all classic triangulations. It creates chaos inside the victim. It makes it impossible to know who to trust.
So this wasn't just youthful teasing, it was psychological breakdown by design?
Exactly. And for someone with Hertervig's sensitivity, it was devastating. He had no psychological defenses, no language for what was happening, no support. He was overwhelmed by a form of social violence he had no way to process. And this is where no contact comes in.
So this is where no contact becomes relevant?
Yes. When he returned to Stavanger after Gousted, he did the only thing that could save him. He withdrew completely. He went no contact long before the term existed. No contact means cutting all ties with people who harm you, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. For Hertervig, this wasn't a choice. It was survival. If he had continued seeking out the environments that manipulated him, he likely would have been destroyed. By withdrawing, he stopped the flow of new manipulation, stopped the gaslighting, stopped the triangulation, stopped the social humiliation, stopped the emotional confusion. He created a space where he could finally hear his own voice again.
So his isolation wasn't a sign of illness, it was a sign of survival?
Yes, that's the key. His isolation wasn't a symptom, it was a strategy, an intuitive, deeply wise strategy. He withdrew to save his own psyche, and in that space, in that silence, he began to rebuild himself. That's where he reconnected with nature, with light, with the inner landscape. That's where he found his visionary language. No contact was not an escape. It was liberation.
Chapter 14. How Modern Psychology Can Read Hertervig's Life Today. Thor, we've talked a lot about Hertervig's life and art, but I want to zoom out for a moment. How can modern psychology, with today's concepts, research, and understanding, interpret Hertervig's life in ways earlier generations simply couldn't?
That's an essential question, because today we stand with a psychological map that didn't exist in the 19th century. Back then, as the Norwegian Biographical Encyclopedia notes, they used terms like melancholia and dementia, broad, imprecise, and often stigmatizing labels. Today, we have a far more nuanced vocabulary for what happened to him. First, we can see that Hertervig was a highly sensitive person, what we now call HSP. That doesn't mean weakness. It's a neuropsychological trait. You take in more information, more emotional resonance, more subtlety than others. It makes people like Hertervig extraordinarily receptive to beauty and extraordinarily vulnerable to pain.
So his sensitivity wasn't a flaw, it was part of his gift?
Exactly. And that's what modern psychology helps us understand. But at the same time, high sensitivity also makes you more susceptible to narcissistic abuse, gaslighting, and triangulation, everything he was subjected to in Düsseldorf. Today, we would say he experienced a form of relational trauma. How modern psychology would describe Düsseldorf?
How would modern psychology describe what happened to him in Düsseldorf?
We would say he was subjected to gaslighting, making him doubt his own reality, triangulation, using Helene as a pawn in a social game, narcissistic manipulation, mockery, humiliation, exclusion, collective bullying, a group working together to break down one person. These aren't trivial behaviors. These are psychological mechanisms that can cause collapse even in resilient individuals, and Hertervig was anything but resilient in social terms. How modern psychology interprets its breakdown,
And how does modern psychology interpret its breakdown?
not as a born madness, as people believed then, but as a reaction to extreme emotional overload. Today we might talk about complex PTSD, trauma responses, identity fragmentation, reactive psychosis. All of these can arise when a sensitive person is subjected to prolonged psychological pressure. How modern psychology views his isolation.
And what about his isolation in Stavanger? How does modern psychology see that?
As a self-protective strategy, what we now call no contact. When you've been manipulated, gaslit, and emotionally exploited, The only thing that helps is often complete withdrawal. Not to punish anyone, but to save yourself. Modern psychology tells us that no contact stops the flow of new harm, gives the brain space to regulate, allows you to hear your own inner voice again, breaks the manipulator's narrative. Hertervig did this intuitively. He had no terminology for it, no therapy, no support. But he had nature, and he had art. Art as emotional regulation.
So his art was a form of self-regulation?
Yes, art became his way of regulating emotion. It was therapy before therapy existed. In modern psychological terms, we would call it affect regulation, trauma integration, inner reorganization, symbolic processing. When he painted light, he painted hope. When he painted water, he painted emotional depth. When he painted forests, he painted an inner room where he could be safe. He used art as a kind of internal architecture, a place to live when the world became too harsh. A new way of seeing Hertervig.
So modern psychology allows us to see Hertervig as more than a case?
Yes, modern psychology allows us to see him as a sensitive human being, subjected to relational trauma, who used art to heal himself, and who found a language larger than his pain. He wasn't a symptom. He was a survivor. And his art isn't an illness, it's transformation.
Chapter 15. How Hertervig's art functioned as self-regulation and trauma integration. Thor, you've mentioned that Hertervig used art as a form of self-regulation. But can you explain how that worked? How can we understand his art as an early example of what modern psychology calls trauma integration?
Absolutely. And this is one of the most fascinating dimensions of his life. Today, we have terms like affect regulation, trauma integration, internal reorganization, and somatic processing. But Hertervig had none of that vocabulary. No therapist, no psychological framework, no language for what he was experiencing. He had only himself and nature and art. And yet he instinctively did something modern psychologists would recognize immediately. He used creative work to regulate his nervous system. How we see this in the paintings.
How do we see that concretely in the paintings?
We see it in the way he paints light, in the way he paints water, in the way he paints space. Light as hope, water as emotional depth, forest as an inner room. These aren't random motifs. They're psychological structures. When he paints light breaking through trees, it isn't just aesthetic, it's an emotional movement. It's the nervous system seeking regulation. It's the psyche searching for balance. Modern trauma psychology tells us that people who've endured gaslighting, manipulation, and relational trauma often lose contact with their inner rhythm, their sense of what's true, what's safe, what belongs to them. Hertervig paints himself back into that rhythm, art as a way of gathering the self.
So his art was a way of gathering himself?
Yes, art became his way of regulating emotion. It was therapy before therapy existed. When he paints water, he's painting his feelings, but in a way that makes them manageable. When he paints forests, he's painting a room where he can be alone without being abandoned. When he paints light, he's painting a path out of darkness. This is classic trauma integration. Taking what is chaotic and giving it form. Taking what is wordless and giving it a language. Taking what is fragmented and making it coherent. Art as inner architecture.
It almost sounds like he used art as a form of inner architecture.
That's exactly it. He built an inner house through his paintings, a place to live when the world became too harsh. Modern psychology tells us that people who've experienced relational trauma often need to create an internal space where they can feel safe. Hertervig did this through nature motifs. The forest became his room. The water became his emotional mirror. The light became his way forward. How this connects to no contact.
How does this connect to his decision to go no contact?
They're inseparable. When he cut ties with the environment that had harmed him, he created an external space of silence. When he painted, he created an internal space of meaning. No contact stopped the flow of new harm. Art created the possibility of healing. It's a combination modern trauma psychology would recommend. Remove yourself from what injures you and build something that restores you. Hertervig did both, intuitively. Art as process, not product.
So his art wasn't just expression, it was a process?
Yes, a process that allowed him to keep living. A process that gave him a language for what had happened. A process that transformed pain into something beautiful, something universal. That's why I say Hertervig wasn't just an artist. He was an early example of how human beings use creativity to integrate trauma. He didn't paint to be understood. He painted to understand himself. And in doing so, he created something that still moves us today.
Chapter 16. How Herdervig's art shapes contemporary artists. Thor, we've talked about how Herdervig was rediscovered after his death. But what about today? How does he influence modern artists, in Norway and internationally?
It's a fascinating question, because Herdervig isn't just a figure from the past. He's a living current. Many artists today recognize themselves in him, not only in his visual language, but in the emotional terrain he navigated. He embodies something profoundly human, the struggle to protect one's inner voice in the face of pressure, rejection, and psychological strain. And his influence shows up in three powerful ways. One, he shows that vulnerability can be an artistic strength. In an era where artists explore identity, psychology, and the inner landscape, Herdervig stands as an early beacon. He proves that sensitivity isn't a flaw, it's a source of depth. He shows that art doesn't need to be loud or monumental to be powerful. It can be quiet, fragile, almost translucent, and still strike with extraordinary force. Many young artists today are doing exactly what he did, making the inner world visible, using vulnerability as material, turning the personal into the universal. Herdervig was doing this long before it became a recognized artistic path. Two, he opens the door to nature as psychological space.
You mean that nature in his paintings isn't just nature?
Exactly. And that's what modern artists have embraced. Today, many use landscape as a metaphor for memory, psyche, and emotional states. Herdervig was one of the first to do this. He didn't paint mountains and trees as geography. He painted them as inner rooms, places where the soul could move. This has inspired painters, installation artists, video artists, and performance artists. They see in Herdervig a way of using nature not as scenery, but as emotional architecture. Three, he shows that art can be self-regulation, not just expression. This may be his most modern legacy. Today we talk about art as therapy, art as processing, art as emotional regulation. Herdervig was doing this intuitively. He used art to hold himself together, to integrate trauma, to find meaning in chaos. Many contemporary artists work this way, using art to understand themselves, to navigate life, to transform pain into something luminous. Herdervig shows that this isn't a trend. It's a human necessity.
So does he influences not just aesthetics, but the role of the artist?
Yes, and that may be his deepest impact. He shows that the artist doesn't need to be a heroic figure, but a human being trying to find a place in the world. He shows that art can come from vulnerability, not just strength. He shows that the inner life is as important as the outer motif. That's why he resonates so strongly with artists today. He reminds them that art isn't primarily about technique, it's about truth, about daring to look inward, about daring to be human. One Stavanger art museum keeps Herdervig alive for new generations. Museum Stavanger, especially Stavanger Art Museum, plays a crucial role in keeping Herdervig alive. They do something extraordinary. They let visitors enter the painting old pine trees through the installation Lars Hertervig's Secrets. It's not just an exhibition, it's an experience. You step into his inner landscape. You feel the light, the space, the stillness. You encounter nature the way he did, as psyche, as memory, as energy. And because it's free for children, youth, And students, new generations meet him not as a historical figure, but as a contemporary voice.
So, does the museum make him relevant for today's artists?
Yes, and not just relevant, intimate. When young artists walk into secrecy, they don't meet a man from the 1800s. They meet an artist speaking directly to them about vulnerability, inner rooms, light as hope, nature as psyche, the struggle to preserve one's voice. These themes are deeply alive in contemporary art. Two, he inspires artists who seek the existential. Hertervig is often placed alongside Edvard Munch in terms of psychological depth and the ability to convey the inner landscape. It's no coincidence that artists like Odd Nerdrum, Kitty Kieland, Carl Oskar Schellbrud, Vebjørn Sand, and Kaan Bleeken have cited him as an influence. What do they find in him? An uncompromising inner truth, a visionary style untouched by trends, a nature charged with meaning, an ability to turn pain into form, a silence that speaks louder than words. He shows that art doesn't need to shout to be powerful. It can whisper and still shake you.
You often say he painted the energy around him. How does that influence artists today?
In two ways. Aesthetic influence. Many artists today work with light, transparency, atmosphere, and inner landscapes in ways that echo Hertervig, not as imitation, but as resonance. B. Psychological influence. Hertervig shows that art can be self-regulation, trauma integration, inner architecture, resistance, meaning. That's why he speaks so strongly to artists working with existential themes. He shows that you can paint your way through darkness and out the other side. 3. He gives artists the courage to be different. Hertervig wasn't understood in his own time. He was marginalized, incapacitated, overlooked. But he kept painting. He kept following his inner voice. For today's artists, who often face pressure to be commercial, trendy, or instantly relevant, Hertervig is a model of resilience. He shows that staying true to your inner language can matter more than being understood immediately. And that may be his greatest influence. He gives artists the courage to be themselves.
So, he influences not just the art, but the artist?
Yes, Hertervig shapes the way artists think about their own work. He reminds them that art can be a room for healing, a room for truth, a room for stillness, a room for resistance, a room for light. And that's why he still lives, not just in museums, but in people.
Chapter 17. How today's audience respond to Hertervig's art. Thor, we've talked about how artists are influenced by Hertervig. But what about the public? How do people today react when they encounter his work, whether at Stavanger Art Museum or elsewhere?
What's so striking is that audiences respond with a mixture of silence and recognition. It's as if his paintings speak directly to something in us that doesn't have words. Many describe it as an inner resonance, a sense that the landscape isn't just a landscape, but a room they recognize from their own interior world. And that's no accident. Hertervig didn't paint nature as an external motif. He painted nature as psyche. So, when people stand before old pine trees or forest lake, they're not just seeing aesthetics. They're feeling atmosphere, memory, stillness. They're sensing something that resembles their own emotional terrain. How this shows up in the museum.
How does this manifest concretely in the museum?
Stavanger Art Museum has done something brilliant with Lars Hertervig's secrets. When visitors are allowed to step into the painting, something shifts. The distance collapses. They stop being observers and become participants. Children lie down on the floor and stare up into the pine canopy. Adults stand still and breathe more deeply. Students remove their headphones and simply listen to the room. It's as if the installation gives them access to Hertervig's inner space, and, through that, to their own. An emotional response, often stronger than expected.
So, audience respond emotionally?
Yes, and often more intensely than they expect. Many describe a sense of calm, Others feel a kind of melancholic beauty. Some begin to cry without fully understanding why. That's because Hertervig paints what we all carry: the silence, the vulnerability, the longing for light, the need for a place to belong. He doesn't paint drama, he paints the quiet cry. And people recognize that cry. How young people respond.
What about young people? How do they react?
That may be the most moving part. Young people, living in a world of noise, speed, and constant stimulation, often respond with almost physical relief. They walk into the room and settle. They say things like, "It feels like being alone, but in a good way. It's like the painting is breathing. I feel safe here."
What about visitors who know his life story?
They often respond with deep respect. When you know what he endured: gaslighting, social exclusion, poverty, legal incapacitation, the paintings become even more powerful. You see the light as resistance. You see nature as psyche. You see the forest as a room he built to survive. People often say, "I'm not just seeing a landscape. I'm seeing a human being trying to stay whole." And that's exactly what he was doing. A recognition he never received in life.
So today's audience meets him in a way he never experienced while he was alive?
Yes, he is finally seen, not as a case, but as an artist, not as a patient, but as a pioneer, not as a man who broke down, but as a man who rose through his art. Audiences respond with silence, with wonder, with recognition, and with gratitude, because Hertervig gives them something rare: a room where they can meet themselves without being judged.
Chapter 18. The Final Years. A Life in Shadow and Art in Light. Thor, how did his art evolve toward the end of his life? It's easy to imagine his world growing darker, but what happened to the paintings?
That's one of the most fascinating paradoxes in Hertervig's life. The darker his circumstances became, the brighter his art grew. He lived in poverty, on the margins, often forgotten. He rented tiny rooms, struggled financially, and was treated as someone without value. And yet, he kept painting, and the works from his final years are among the most visionary he ever created.
Visionary in what sense?
They become more dreamlike, more symbolic, more translucent. It's as if he no longer paints landscapes as they look, but as they feel. He discovers a language entirely his own, a language that today reads like early modernism. It's almost as if he's painting from a place outside of time, a place where nature isn't just nature, but an inner state, a place where light doesn't just fall, it speaks.
It's striking that a man who lived so marginally could create something so boundless.
Exactly. And that's what makes him so extraordinary. He didn't paint for the market. He didn't paint for the academy. He didn't paint for recognition. He painted because he had to, because it was his way of being in the world. And in those final years, he frees himself completely from the rules of the Düsseldorf school. He paints on cheap paper, on cardboard, on whatever he can find. But the decline in materials stands in stark contrast to the clarity of his artistic vision.
So even as his life grew smaller, his art grew larger?
His late works, Forest Lake, Borgia, those small paper visions, aren't just landscapes. They're spiritual rooms, places where pain and beauty meet, where vulnerability becomes form, where loneliness becomes light.
It's almost as if he painted himself out of the darkness.
Yes, he didn't paint to escape life. He painted to understand it, to hold on to something larger than poverty, larger than rejection, larger than the diagnoses imposed on him. He painted to preserve his own humanity.
So when we look at Hertervig's final paintings, we're really seeing a man who found an inner room no one could take from him?
Exactly. He lived in shadow, but he painted in light. And that light is what we carry forward today.
Chapter 19. The Rediscovery. From Oblivion to Genius. It's almost impossible to grasp that a man who painted so much light died in the shadows. But the story doesn't end there. How was Hertervig rediscovered?
It's one of the most remarkable rediscoveries in Norwegian art history. When Hertervig died in 1902, he was essentially forgotten. He was buried without ceremony, without recognition, without anyone truly understanding what he had created. But then, a few decades later, something begins to stir. It's as if art history suddenly notices a light it had walked past for years.
What triggered this rediscovery?
Several things. First, art historians and collectors began looking closely at his small paper works, the ones he painted on cheap cardboard, on wrapping paper, even in newspapers. They realized these pieces had a unique force, a visionary quality unlike anything else in Norwegian art. Then came the 1920s and 30s, the era when modernism began to take root. Suddenly, people saw that Hertervig, this poor, marginalized man, had painted something that resembled modernism before modernism existed.
So, he was ahead of his time?
Yes, radically so. And that's what makes him so compelling. He didn't paint to be modern. He painted because that's how he saw the world. But in hindsight, we see that he was a pioneer. Someone who broke with academic rules long before it became fashionable to do so. Art historians began to understand that Hertervig wasn't a madman painting strange landscapes, but a visionary artist who had developed an entirely original language.
Who were the key figures in this rediscovery?
Several played crucial roles. Sigurd Willich, the art historian, was one of the first to elevate Hertervig as one of Norway's most original landscape painters. Stavanger Art Museum, now must, began collecting and exhibiting his works, giving them a home and a context. And then there were the writers, Sigbjørn Obstfelder and later John Foss, who wrote about Hertervig with a rare sensitivity. They didn't see him as a medical case. They saw him as a human being painting from a place of vulnerability and truth. These voices helped shift the narrative from pathology to poetry.
So, it took nearly half a century for the world to understand what he had done.
Yes, and that tells you how radical he truly was. Some artists celebrate in their own time. Others must wait for the world to catch up. Hertervig belongs to the latter. He didn't paint for his own era. He painted for the future. And when the future finally arrived, it recognized him, not as a footnote, but as a genius.
Chapter 20. Hertervig today, an artist who still takes our breath away. 4. How do we see Hertervig today? What does he mean to us now?
Today, he's regarded as one of the most original artists Norway has ever produced. Not because he painted beautifully, but because he painted truthfully. He shows us that art can be a way to survive, a way to make meaning out of pain, a way to give shape to the inner world. And perhaps most importantly, he shows us that vulnerability is not weakness. It's a form of clarity.
So, when we look at the Hertervig landscape today, we're not just seeing nature, we're seeing a human being struggle to find light.
Exactly. And that's why he still moves us, because he painted something universal, something timeless, something about what it means to be human in a world that isn't always gentle. He died in the shadows, but his art lives in the light. And that light, the one he carried alone, the one he poured into paper and pigment, is the light we stand in now.
Chapter 21. Conclusion. Thor, if you had to summarize Hertervig's life in one sentence, what would you say?
That he is living proof of how a human being can take their deepest pain and turn it into light.
Thank you for sharing this journey with us. This conversation hasn't just opened our eyes to Hertervig's art, it's opened our eyes to the man behind it. A man who carried more than most, and who still created something that shines.
Thank you. It's always an honor to lift up an artist who reminds us that vulnerability can be a form of strength, and that even those who live in the shadows can leave behind a light that lasts.
And to those of you watching, if you ever find yourself standing before a Hertervig landscape, take a moment. Look past the trees, past the water, past the light. Somewhere in there is a human being who fought to find his own voice and who found it. We'll see you in the next episode.